Hello my quilting friends! Welcome back to the Eternal Love Quilt Along. Today we're going to be finishing up the quilting on this beautiful goddess quilt. We're going to stitch 3 different designs, one over her shirt, one over the baby, and one in the background. So let's get started learning how to free motion quilt 3 beautiful designs together. So I'm going to start with the shirt, and I'm filling this area with basic spiral, and you can see this is just a really nice open spirally design. And how it's quilted is you first form that spiral shape, but the key to this is leaving double the amount of space open between those lines of quilting, so then as you come out you have plenty of space to work your way all the way out and around, swirling around and then into another shape. So here I'm going to go into another one and talk you through it. Now as I come for that curl right there, that's when I'm looking at the distance between my needle and that line I just stitched and trying to leave double the amount of space that I want open as I go all the way into the center and then stitch right through the middle to get back out again. Now we have a lot of weird spaces in this shirt, a lot of little areas to tuck into and out of, so please don't panic if your lines of quilting get a little closer together. Mine did just right there. Sometimes they might widen out just a bit too. And you know what, that's the nice thing about basic spiral is it still looks good even when it's inconsistent. This is one of those designs that's really nice to stitch in places like this because you can kind of get away with little gaps and stuff within the texture. Now right here I have a choice. I can kind of tuck in between these spiral shapes and stitch something, or I can leave it open, and I'm going to practice leaving it open. I find that sometimes with this design, when I wiggle my way into an area that's already, pretty much good enough, it's secured well enough, there's good enough texture through that space, I find oftentimes I end up regretting it. So I'm going to leave that open and blank, and I'm going to keep moving with the design. Now one thing that I talked about just a little bit whenever I was filling in the other video, when I was doing the other free motion quilting video and stitching stippling, is how I like to fill in rows. And you can kind of see how this is working even right now. I started in her sleeve, I'll work over here just a bit and then I'll kind of indicate exactly how I've moved. So I started right here on her sleeve and wiggled my way up, and then came back down and then stitched kind of a little row upwards again, and then came straight over to the side of her neck, and then now I'm wiggling my way back down. So I really want to try and fill the space as consistently as possible and without leaving gaps in there that I have to go back and wiggle in and fill in later. So it's kind of like as I go, I'm trying to fill the whole thing at once. Kind of like painting a wall. You don't want to leave a big blotch open that you have to then, haul all your materials back over there and fill it in later. You want to, paint the entire wall as you go. Now I'm working my way down, and again, leaving double the amount of space so that way I have room to get back out again. Now, if this kind of spiral doesn't work for you, if you just can't think through it that way and that doesn't work, that's okay. You can also stitch another design, it's called Cucumber Vine, where you stitch basically a closed spiral and do travel stitching to get your way back out again. And that's just, it's a slightly different texture. You build up just a little bit more thread, but that's a-okay. Now sometimes you're gonna have to cut it in half. So right here, you can see I had to cut this one in half, and I'm just filling in that space with little gentle arch shapes. That's good too. Sometimes, and the best thing to do in this situation, put your hand on the design that you have already stitched, kind of cover it up and take a look at what that looks like. What does that design look like when it's cut off partially? And that's what you will use to fill in any weird gaps that appear that, really you can't fit a spiral into that space. But here we go. Now I'm going to curl around this lock of hair. And I might end up shrinking these lines of quilting. I am generally stitching this design just on a slightly bigger scale than I have before, than I did in the hair, and that's a-okay. Nice thing about a wall hanging is you can really push your edge. You can leave certain things a little bit more open you can also shrink things down and stitch a little bit more densely in areas too. You don't want to have too radical of a difference. So like in the background, I might have problems if I, for example, like left 1 inch of space or more between my lines of quilting. Probably wouldn't end up having a quilt that would hang very well if I did that, if I stitched on a 1-inch scale versus a 1/4 inch scale, as I pretty much kept 1/4 inch or 1/8 inch consistently throughout this quilt. Now I finished that off. I had a nice little spiral there. I'm really pleased with that, but it looks like I've kind of stitched myself into a little bit of a corner here. Yeah, I'm kind of stuck. I just noticed that as I was coming out of that spiral, Well, the nice thing is you can always travel stitch your way back out again. That's what's really nice about having these appliques already zigzag stitched, is I can just stitch right along that, and I'm going to have just a little spiral, partial spiral come in right there on her neckline, and then I'm going to now travel stitch along that outer neckline. And then now, see, I've escaped. Please don't ever feel like that's illegal or against the rules or anything like that. You can always stitch along the edges of the appliques to get back out again. And you can see now all I have to do is fill in this last little bit with a few more rows of basic spiral, and it will be complete. So the next design we're going to quilt together is this beautiful swirling feather. And I know I'm using really close matching thread to my fabric color. It's kind of hard to see, but I'm going to talk you through it. So here we go. I'm going to start with a nice big spiral shape. So this is kind of similar to what we were doing with basic spiral, but we're going to leave it a lot more open. So I'm just going to kind of create a little hook shape. And then now I'm going to echo that about 1/8 of an inch all the way back down to my starting point. There we go. Now we have the inside of the hook and the outside of the hook. And I'll be honest, I always find it easier to stitch into the inside of the hook because that area just seems like building up my feathers that direction kind of sets a good stage for the outer feathers, which tend to be bigger. So I'm going to go to the inside of the hook first, swirling out and creating a small series of feathers. These are travel back feathers. That means I'm traveling back along the back of one feather to make the next one. So here we go, swirl out and around, and then I'm just kind of hitting up against that hook shape, that vine line that we just stitched. And now the top feather just kind of nestles into the top part of that hook. Now I'm going to travel stitch all the way back to the beginning. I don't know about you, but my brain does not work very well with flipping feathers. If yours does, congratulations, mine doesn't. So I travel stitch all the way back to the beginning, and then I form a new set of feathers. And these are going to stretch out and be much bigger than the first set. And the reason being, you pretty much have an open playing field here. You have lots of room to stitch into, and you want to go on ahead and try and fill up as much as you can. So this is a situation where we're really expanding our scale. We're letting the lines of quilting, the distance between those lines of quilting get a little bit further apart, but we're also adding this really nice texture to the baby wrap area. And while it's not going to stand out as in, I'm not contrasting thread here, it's definitely going to stand out with a beautiful bold texture on the surface. So now I'm swinging around. You can see how I'm expanding these feathers slowly. Like this one, I just decided to go in and expand it all the way up to reach the very edge. Whenever you can, go on ahead and fill in the space completely. You really don't want to leave little narrow gaps in this texture. Those are hard to fill. Okay, so now I'm coming back around and I want to match this up with the swirling water that I have before. So I'm going to swing all the way out, kind of run up right against a swirling feather shape that I had before. And I just kind of nestle these last few feathers right in those gaps. It can get a little bit weird in that area, but the good thing is that's usually not very noticeable. Okay, so now I'm going to travel stitch back. Yeah, usually those feathers right there at the end, they kind of compact a little bit and you just really can't see them. It's your nice big feathers that really stand out nicely on the quilt. Okay, so now I'm going to escape from that area by travel stitching between two feathers. I'm going to think about where I want to go next in this design. So I'm going to grab a marking pencil I've said many times before that that's perfectly allowed. Anytime, grab a marking pencil, plan it out. So maybe a hook shape, something like that. Then I'll be able to expand some feathers to go all the way into that little nook and cranny I left open and be able to swirl all the way around her arm and also maybe be able to work a little bit that way too. But remember, we want to do the inside. We want to quilt the inside of the hook first. Well, first thing we want to do is quilt the hook itself. So here we go. Swirl out and then echo back all the way to the starting point. And now I'm going to swirl out with a feather and just build those up one by one. I keep these relatively small on this side just because when they start to get too large, it can just get a little unwieldy. Now sometimes it goes a little bit weird here right around the hook. In this case it did. That's okay. You can see I just kind of swirled in there. I put a smaller feather in and then a bigger feather, and that worked out good. Okay, now let's make some nice big feathers filling in this space to the back. These along the back of the hook, that's always going to be bigger. And this one, I really want to work all the way into that nook and cranny I left open. That looks great. It is hard to see whenever you're stitching backwards like that, and I was just kind of guesstimating. I could have easily overshot it. Definitely rotate your quilting space. If you're ever stitching something and just you don't feel like you can see it, you don't feel like you know how big that feather should be, it's much easier, like right here, you can see exactly how big that feather is and how far it's going to come down. Here's this one. Swirl out and around. These are getting quite large. That's a-okay. And then I think I want to start to shrink them down as I work this direction. There we go. Maybe just a little bit smaller. And one or two more. Just one more. That looks good. And I have one little weird area. I can pop in a little feather right there. I'm happy with that. That looks great. You know, it's one of those things where you just kind of fit it in and they kind of lock together. It's kind of like a puzzle. And this whole quilt has been a little bit like a puzzle. Putting the fusible appliques together is a little bit of a puzzle, and then actually getting the quilting designs to kind of fit together nicely is a bit of a puzzle too. So from here, I'm just going to continue adding more hook shapes, more little swirly hook shapes, and then adding the feathers, building those feathers up one by one. Just kind of letting them grow naturally together. I really do like to quilt the inside first, then travel stitch my way back down. But I want you to experiment with that and see which way works better for you. You know, in my perspective, a lot of times I will build off the outer feathers around the inner feathers. But I'd love to know what works better for you. You know, that might not work at all. And it might also not work to do travel back. There's lots of other types of feathers that you can do as well. So I'm just going to swing around. I've got a lot of little weird gaps here. And I'm going to really shrink these feathers down as I work into it. And I can't quite see what I'm doing, so I'm going to rotate just a bit. Now I can see so clearly. Here we go. And I want to take that feather all the way out, hit the edge of the other feather, and then one more time. There we go. That looks great. It's really exciting when it really starts to come together and you see that pretty texture. You know, it's feathers kind of swirling in all different directions. So even if you stitch off, like right there, I stitched off my line, my vine line just a bit, no worries. Throw a little bit more thread at it. You can get away with a lot when you blend thread color just like this. Okay, so there's one last weird area in this, and that is this area right over the baby's head. And I'm going to travel stitch up there. I will definitely fill in the rest of this space with more swirling feathers. I think you've got the hang of that. You can see how that's going to work. Let's talk about how to fill this space. This is a little tricky, and I honestly am going to change designs and stitch just a series of very simple feathers into this area, and I think I'm going to have them curl out this way. So I'm just swinging out and around. This is going to feel really similar to the echo feather design that we stitched into the hair. You're just, again, having one feather build off the other, kind of started angled in one direction. We've slowly brought them around so that they're angled in this direction. So as I get near to this little overlap spot, it's going to look really good. And I'll have space for one more, just one more right there. There's a lot of creative ways that you could fill that space, but I just really think with the swirling feathers in the baby wrap area, I think it looks perfect. So here's what it looked like whenever I finished quilting swirling feathers in the baby. So now it's time to quilt the background, and the first step is to mark an outline all around the quilt. So I'm going to take out all of my remaining pens and pen moors and then mark that outline. And the finished quilt is 20 by 25. And this is really nice because it can get real easy to just kind of start stitching all over the place, especially down here on this bottom edge. And honestly, all of that's going to get cut off. So there's absolutely no point in quilting more than you have to. That's wasting your time. You really just don't even need to do it. Now you can see here, I accidentally basted with a piece of batting that wasn't quite big enough. So I want to make sure that I start on that edge, and I'm going to measure over pretty much from where that is actually stable and I have batting coming through, and I'm going to measure over 20 inches. So let's see where that is exactly. So this is an 18.5-inch ruler. Whenever you buddy up rulers this way, you just kind of have to keep in mind all the measurements you've got going on. I've got an 18.5-inch ruler, and then this is a 6.5-inch ruler. So if I take into account the 18.5, the 19.5, and then the 20-inch mark is going to be right here. So just mark that on your quilt, and I like to mark both sides. It's a 1.5-inch mark right there. And then I can take the ruler, make sure it's nice and straight, and mark all the way down the line. So that's going to really be my starting line. Now I'm not going to cut, I'm not going to do anything with this line initially. This is just going to be my guideline for stopping quilting, so that I know whenever I see this line, whenever I'm getting near it on the quilt, then I just stop quilting right there. I maybe quilt up to it, maybe quilt over it a little bit, but I don't need to quilt this whole segment out here. That would be a waste of my time. That is all going to get cut off. Okay, so there we go. Nice long straight line. Now that I've got that set, I can put line on my ruler here, slide the quilt over, and also mark this opposite side, just like so. So if you don't have a ruler that's long enough, you'll just have to buddy it up like this. And this is no big deal. Just watch out for the rulers slipping. Make sure that they stay nicely locked together. And you may even have to buddy up a third ruler if you only have 12.5-inch rulers. You don't have anything super long like this or super big like this. And that's okay. Sometimes you just got to figure out a way to make it work. So slide this one down. Make sure everything's still lined up. And even if it doesn't work out perfectly, let's say you accidentally measure this and make it a little bit bigger or a little bit smaller, just take a look at it. Make sure that the goddess is nicely centered up in the middle. She doesn't have to finish at 20 by 25. You could make her, finish out just a little bit bigger, whatever you need to fit the space on your wall where she's going to hang. Okay, so now let's talk about going this way to measure the 25. So what I'm going to do is I take this nice long ruler and I'm going to line it up right with the bottom edge of her shirt. And then I'm also lining up a thin line on my ruler with this line that I'm marked over here. So I'm making sure this is nice and straight and square. And I know that this is the point where I want to start because, her shirt is pretty much the only straight line in the quilt. And I want that to be bound up in the binding. I want the bottom edge of her shirt to end up in the binding. Because obviously you don't want her to be kind of floating in midair, to have the binding come in way down here and she's just kind of suspended. That would look a little weird. I think it looks a lot better if her shirt is surrounded by binding in the bottom edge of that quilt. There we go. Okay, so that looks good. So now measuring from there, I've got, again, 18.5, and then here I have it set up so I have my 1/2 inch right here. So that would be 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25. So this right here is actually set up exactly 25 inches. All I need to do is just simply make sure that I've got this nice and straight and square. So I've got this line straight to the bottom edge of the quilt and lined up, running along this line I've marked down along this side. So this is nice and straight, perfectly square, and all I have to do is mark that top edge. So once you get the whole quilt marked and you feel like those lines look good, step back, put it on the wall, step back and take a look at it and make sure she's centered up where you want her to be, because it's a really easy process to tweak these lines a bit if you need to. So let's say you took a look at her and realize, well, you know, there's maybe a little bit more space here between this edge and the baby and not as much space between her hair and that edge, and you might want to fiddle with that and maybe come out a little bit on one side or come in a little bit on the other side. That's perfectly fine. Tweak it as much as you want. You can, of course, come out further this way. As you can see, I did not end up actually centering her as well in that piece of fabric as I would have liked. It was just kind of a flip her over and get her in place, and she was kind of having a little bit of a problem that day. So, you know, I was just happy to have her fall and not completely fall apart whenever I was fusing that applique in place. So she might end up a little smaller for you if the same thing happened, or she might end up bigger. It's totally whatever you want to do. So now that I've got this line marked and ready to go, I'm going to put this on my machine and we're going to start doing the background stitch. And what we're going to start with is an outline. And I really like to do this. You can see it started right here. It's just a little 1/8 inch outline all around her face, all around all of the appliques. What this does is, number one, it fills in little gaps, little tiny spaces really nicely. It also kind of makes the background step away from the goddess so they're not kind of all mushed up next to each other, and it also reduces your thread play. So if you've already done some travel stitching and dense thread work here right along the edges of the appliques, when you go back in with another layer of thread with the background, sometimes that can just be too much and your thread can start breaking. So by bumping out 1/8 of an inch away, doing a little echo, you really reduce that, and I think it just really makes the background, it kind of, I don't know, illuminates the goddess, kind of steps away from her and kind of says, you know, that's the center focus. And then once we get that outline stitched, we're going to fill in all the rest of the background with hot, hot spiral. So I'm working my way around these locks of hair with this outline quilting. And this is one of those things that just requires space estimation. What does that mean? Space estimation is being able to look at your needle and kind of judge the distance between that and the edge of your quilt. So here I'm trying to stay about 1/8 of an inch from that quilt, and I'm working my way into this really narrow little channel here between these locks of hair. And I'm just going to go back as far as I think it looks good and then work my way back out again. I'm going to do a little bit of travel stitching along that outline just to get my way back out of that space. And I'm going to leave that area open. I've got this little tiny slice of space. I'm not going to bother filling that in with anything. You know, I've had some other gaps between the locks of hair that I have filled in with a little bit of our design. But, you know, you got to kind of draw the line somewhere, you know, and I think that's just fine. So now I'm going to continue my outline working around this area, and I'm just eyeballing it more than anything else. I'm just looking at my needle and looking at that edge of the applique and trying to stay consistently spaced, you know, a consistent distance apart. But sometimes it widens out. Like right here, I've come out just a little bit further than I probably wanted to, and that's okay. I'm not going to go pick up a seam ripper and rip it out, because I know that ultimately that's such a tiny little thing. You know, who really cares if it comes out just a little bit more than other spaces? You know, same thing if my lines get a little bit closer together, or, you know, I forget to do the echo quilting completely. Like let's say I narrowed this down and actually touched the edge of the applique and crossed over those other lines of stitching. Even that, I probably wouldn't rip that out, because ultimately when you step back and look at it, it's all going to blend in. You know, I'm quilting with Isacord Shell. It's a really light pink color, and it is blending in almost perfectly with this background fabric. So it's really not even going to show if you mess up, and that can really kind of take it down a notch as far as the fear factor. Now we know that the bottom edge of the shirt is the bottom edge of the quilt. We do not need to stitch beyond it. So now it is time to switch to our background design. And that is Hot, Hot Spiral. This is one of my favorite designs. It's so fun. So you form some flame shapes and some spiral shapes. And I hope you can see how fast this is going to be. You can expand the distance between your lines of quilting a bit. You can go with a 1/4 inch scale and just really be able to knock it out fast. So let me talk you through it here. Now the flame shapes, just wiggly back and forth flame shapes, you're just coming to a sharp point and wiggling back. And then every once in a while, go into one of those basic spiral swirls. So stitch inside, and if you have to, stop and think about it. Now, as you work your way back out again, stitch right through the middle of the space that you left open. There we go. Now I'll go back to flame shapes. Honestly, I think Hot, Hot Spiral is faster and easier than basic spiral because you've got these wiggly flame shapes that can do a lot of work for you. They can really fill in nicely. They can kind of, I don't know, just make the design a little bit more consistent, and you can use a lot more of them than spirals. It's totally up to you. You can use a lot more spirals and flame shapes, whichever one you like better, really. And what I like about this design is it just adds this nice flowing texture, but as you can see, it's very fast to stitch. You know, we're not going to spend a million years on this background, because this is a lot of surface area. This is a huge chunk of the quilt. You don't want to pick something that's going to be super time consuming and take you a million years to finish the quilt. So how am I filling this? You know, how am I actually thinking about the design and working it into this space? Well, the first thing I want you to see, I stitched this in a row. You know, I started down here and I worked my way around, and then now I'm kind of generally going to fill this working all the way to that side. And I'm going to just really just aim to keep it consistent, kind of work my way up that row and then back down again, filling in both some spirals and some flames. You know, because the nice thing about the Hot, Hot Spiral is you could say, okay, 2 flames for every spiral. So every time you stitch 2 flames, then you know it's time for a spiral design. And every once in a while, you know, especially whenever I was teaching in person, someone would ask, well, you know, won't those spirals, you know, if they all build up in one area, won't that stand out and show off? And the answer is no. You know, this is an all-over texture. This is something that is really going to blend together, and anyone that's looking at your quilt closely enough to notice that you've got 2 spirals kind of stitched a little close to one another, you know, they're looking at your quilt a little bit too closely. You know, that's my general feeling about that, and it's not really worth really getting too upset about it anyway. And if you do find that you've got kind of lots of spirals in a row and you notice that, then go down there and add some flame shapes between them, you know, or all around them, and that will make it even out and look more consistent. So there we go. Now I'm coming up on my line that I've got on this corner, and you know, I definitely did have a little bit of issue here. You can see my basting, my edge of my batting. I think I was using a scrap of batting for this quilt. Wasn't quite long enough. That's okay. I was able to mark that line. Here I'm going to stitch right up to it, and I marked that line, and it's still right on the edge of the batting. You know, you don't want to quilt beyond the edge of the batting. That would be just stitching through 2 layers, just 2 layers of cotton fabric, and that might cause you to break thread, and it also won't have that nice plump look that the rest of your quilt will. So we want to make sure that I don't actually run off the edge of that batting, but I think that my line is marked just exactly right, that I'll stay on it the entire way. So there we go. You can see I'm just going to continue wiggling around, filling in spirals, filling in flame shapes. I'm just working my way, at this point, I'm going to work my way back towards the goddess. So here, I'm just going to stitch some spirals and some flames and work my way back. And I always find that it feels most natural, at least for me, to stitch from left to right. So this angle, working from right to left, feels a little awkward, and that's why I only do basically kind of a single line of the design, so that way I can quickly get back over to that opposite side and be able to quilt in a direction that feels really natural. You know, always aim for what feels natural, for what feels easy. If you need to rotate your quilt, definitely do. Don't feel like you can't move it around, shift it, change the angle, whatever you need in order to see it. Because if you can see and if your hands feel comfortable on the quilt, then you're most likely to be able to stitch really nice, pretty stitches. So there we go. That's it for quilting the background, the shirt, and the baby in the Eternal Love quilt. And here's what it looked like whenever I finished filling these spaces. So that's it for this video. I hope you learned a lot and you really enjoyed this process of creating the Eternal Love quilt with me. I really enjoyed sharing this, and I would love to share more goddess quilts. If you'd be interested in that, please leave me a comment below this video and let me know. If you'd like to join in the fun and make the Eternal Love Goddess Quilt too, all you need is a copy of the quilt pattern. You can find it at leahday.com/eternallove. It comes with everything that you need to get started, including full-size templates so you can print out the pieces directly onto your fusible web. It saves you a lot of time, and you can put this quilt together in a matter of days. So I hope you'll come and check that out at leahday.com/eternallove. Until next time, let's go quilt.